More than 2,500 years ago, a man was born who would change the shape of the ancient world. According to stories, his birth was foretold by prophecy, and the king so feared the future power of this newborn that he commanded the infant be killed. But the boy was spared, raised by another woman who treated him as her own son. He would eventually grow strong and become a great leader of his people. Then he freed the captive Jews and started them on their journey to the Promised Land. He taught them about the one true God, the uncreated, omniscient, and omnipotent deity, the Lord of all, without beginning or end, the creator of the universe, the most exalted. He would be called Messiah by the Jews and allow them to build their temple. This story would become integral to the cultural identity of the Israelites and influence their literature for generations. He would serve as a template for just rulers to come, and even for the next Messiah, who would hopefully come to their aid during the Jewish war with Rome. I'm referring, of course, to the Persian king Cyrus the Great. I'm your host, Jason, and this is Dragons in Genesis. According to Exodus, the Israelites had been separated from their homeland for generations and have seemed to have forgotten their cultural identity. They don't recognize Yahweh at first and require numerous miracles to remind them of his power. Some of the men, Moses included, are uncircumcised. They also worship idols, must be reminded of their dietary restrictions, and so on. So at the beginning of Exodus, they seem more Egyptian than Jewish, which would make sense. If you've been living in Egypt for 400 years, you'll probably take on the local customs. Now, this story is supposedly set in 1200 BCE and written by Moses himself, but there are a few problems with that. Firstly, Israel isn't a nation in 1200 BCE. It's still Canaan at that time. The only mention we have of Israel from this time refers to a nomadic tribe that occasionally causes trouble for Egypt until around 1200 BCE, when Egyptian forces mopped the floor with the fledgling tribe and recorded the victory on a stone discovered in Thebes. It reads, "Israel is laid waste, and his seed is no more." The second problem with Moses writing the story is that the book never mentions an author. Mosaic authorship is an idea which was invented many centuries later. In fact, of the 5 books Moses supposedly wrote, Deuteronomy continues after Moses' death. So I guess they used like a Ouija board to summon his spirit so he could continue writing posthumously? I don't know. There's also the fact that Jewish literature prior to the exilic period fails to mention Moses. So prior to the destruction of the temple under Nebuchadnezzar and the exile to Babylon, nobody in Israel had heard of Moses, which would be surprising if he is their greatest folk hero. Exodus draws heavily on the ideas of captivity and separation from homeland experienced by the Jews during the Babylonian exile. When we get into the story of Exodus, we encounter a few problems. Alright, more than just a few. First is the number of people involved in this Exodus. According to the story, there are 600,000 adult male Israelites who leave Egypt following the 10th plague. That's over 500,000 people, but those are just the men. Those men have wives, possibly several, so we can easily put the number of adults at 1.2 million, or more if we factor in polygamy. The number of adult women would, in the context of this story, be higher because we had a period in which all the male babies were slaughtered, and of that group, only Moses survived. So the females weren't killed, so in all likelihood, the adult female population is well over 600,000. And these adults have children. How many? We don't know. The story doesn't tell us, but considering how quickly Israelite women pop out kids, a fact well attested earlier in this story, the child population would be significant. Now we're looking at around 2 million people. But they also took their slaves with them. Granted, not every household had a slave. In fact, it's mentioned that sometimes they shared property, including slaves. But we'd still have a few 100,000. So now we're approaching 2.25 or 2.5 million people who all walked out of Egypt at once. Or a really conservative estimate could go down as low as, say, 1.5 million. What's seriously problematic here is that the amount of people to walk out during the Exodus is greater than the total number of people living in Egypt at the time, which was only about 1.5 million. It's like a Bronze Age clown car. You can only fit 3 or 4 in there, but a dozen just climbed out. Now, at the time that this supposedly occurred, the total population of the world was only about 40 million people, and 1/20th of them all packed up and walked out of one country at the same time. To put that into perspective, it would be as if nearly the entire population of the United States left today and went to Mexico. I'm sorry, but somebody would notice. The next problem we have is the distance. It's only 250 miles from Egypt to Canaan, which means that if they walked out in a single file line, Moses would have reached the promised land before the last people stepped out of Egypt. They literally could have stood in a row, holding hands, and stretched from the land of enslavement to the land of milk and honey. Now, the plague that freed the people was the one where Yahweh murdered all the firstborn Egyptian children. And if we know anything about the God of the Old Testament, or the New for that matter, is that there are always strings attached. And Yahweh tells us what the payment will be for releasing the people from the captivity he engineered. In Exodus 13:1, Yahweh demands the sacrifice of the firstborn Israelite children as an exchange for the Egyptians that he killed. It's a practice he intends to last forever, but only 10 verses later, Moses up and changes God's law so that livestock can be slaughtered in the place of human kids. Pretty thoughtful of him. Now that the sacrifice is over with, Yahweh will lead the Israelites out of Egypt and to the Promised Land. This is a straight walk along the coast. One could just follow the beach and watch the sun set over the Mediterranean each evening and arrive at Canaan in a couple of weeks. Or they could follow the trade routes that caravans and Egyptian soldiers used on a daily basis. The same trade routes that the Kenites used when trading between Egypt and Canaan, which is likely how Yahweh worship traveled from the Shasu tribe in the Midian Valley up into Israel in the first place. In fact, it would be nearly impossible to get lost, especially considering there were settlements, towns, outposts, and granaries all along the way where one might stop and ask for directions. Yet somehow, even with divine help, it's going to take 40 years to make the journey, because reasons. So the Israelites begin to follow the site of a volcano, described as smoke during the day and fire and lightning at night, accompanied by earthquakes, imagery which is also likely borrowed from the Kenites. And they follow this until Yahweh returns to Egypt to once more enter Pharaoh's heart and revoke the leader's free will. He sends Pharaoh to attack the Israelites in Exodus 14. Now, at this point, Pharaoh somehow had no idea that the Israelites had left Egypt, despite giving them permission to leave the day before and hearing the thunderous march of slaves that outnumbered the entire nation 2-1. Somehow, they all walked out without Pharaoh noticing. Then Yahweh runs back to Moses and instructs him where to camp so that Pharaoh and his soldiers can catch up to the Israelites and attack them, and even explains that he just instructed Pharaoh to do so. I'm not kidding. Read Exodus 14. It says that. Yahweh sets up the entire attack on the Israelites so that he can teach the Egyptians another lesson and show the Israelites that they should fear him. Later, the Egyptian army catches up to the Israelites and launch an attack, whereupon Moses parts the waters of the Sea of Reeds, and the whole of his followers march through on dry land. Then Yahweh makes the Egyptians attack so he will have an opportunity to brag about his own glory. Another detail which is explicitly stated in Exodus 14:7. The Egyptians rush into the sea, surrounded by towering walls of water on both sides. At this point, the Egyptians, all of them, come to the realization that Yahweh is indeed the one true God. He has just converted the whole of the Egyptian army as they stand in awe of his power. And true to form, Yahweh looks down on his newly converted children and kills every single one of them, so that his favorites, the Israelites, will be terrified of him. He doesn't want to convert the Egyptians to the true religion, but to manipulate them into a trap and kill them so his chosen people will be terrified of their new God. And as I've stated in previous episodes, this is not my interpretation of the scripture. This is what is actually stated in Exodus. Now, this particular segment is similar to a tale of King Sargon, marching an army over a sea of reeds to invade a foreign city-state by the grace of the gods, which allow him to, quote, pass on dry land, the same phrasing used in Exodus. And of course, we can't forget about the brilliant use of floodwaters by Hammurabi, who dammed up rivers to conquer cities, and if the inhabitants didn't surrender due to lack of water, he broke the dams and let the man-made lake rush down and destroy their defenses and armies. There are also stories of Dionysus and Senefru and other people working miracles where they part waters or lift up the waters so people can walk through on dry land, escape armies, find baubles, all sorts of different things. All of these stories, of course, predate the Moses story by many centuries. Now, after crossing and witnessing the barbarity of their God, the Israelites sing a song of praise about the war god, even naming him Yahweh the warrior in Exodus 15:3, where it states, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoils. This is obviously a reference to the original nature of Yahweh, called Yahweh Sabaoth, the Lord of armies, worshipped as a war god in Midian. In this hymn, they sing, Who is like you, O Yahweh, among the other gods in heaven? Exodus 15:11, exposing their belief in multiple gods. Though the Israelites worship only one, the idea that many gods exist is still pervasive. And here we encounter another problem during this song as they sing about how terrified the people of Philistine, Edom, Moab, and Canaan are, and their reactions to the arriving army. This is obviously a hymn written after their encounter with these people, not before. So how are they singing this on the banks of the Red Sea after crossing out of Egypt? They're literally singing about enemies that they've defeated years before they will even encounter them in the story. From here, the Israelites follow Moses into the desert and instantly grow displeased with him because there's no water to drink. Because, he took 2 million people into the desert with no water. Yahweh responds by telling the people that if they obey his commandments, he will not curse them with the same diseases he used against the Egyptians. Two things here. How did Yahweh not foresee that humans would need water while marching across the desert? And how are they supposed to obey his commandments when he hasn't given them to the people yet? And also, why is he threatening these same people with diseases simply because they want something to drink? Okay, 3 things, not 2. A few days later, the Israelites grow upset again, this time because they are starving. Yahweh again gets upset with their demands and decides to test them, because that's what you do to starving people in the desert. He's going to give them a portion of food each day, and a double portion on the 6th day that they must gather to eat on the 7th day, because they're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. despite that commandment not existing yet. And apparently, all the previous tests and the 4 centuries of abandonment weren't enough. Each day they get bread, and each evening they get quail. Anything left uneaten becomes immediately infested with maggots. So that's the setup. On the seventh day, when they go out to gather food, Yahweh throws a tantrum because they disobeyed the commandment that he is yet to give, forbidding them from working on the Sabbath. It then tells us that they ate like this for the next 40 years. Wait a second. They're supposed to gather extra on the sixth day that they can eat it on the seventh. But then it states that anything extra gets infested with maggots. I think Yahweh overlooked something here. Maybe that's why they went out looking for food on the Sabbath, because when they awoke on Saturday, all of their extra food was crawling with maggots. The water issue keeps arising, upsetting Yahweh again and again, and Moses must remedy the problem by striking a rock with a stick, so that it creates a spring and his followers can drink. This mimics a miracle that Dionysus performed, only he did it with wine instead of water, which is a far better miracle. So now this rock begins pouring out water where Moses is standing, like a Bronze Age water fountain. Now let's say this spring is wide enough for 5 people to drink at the same time, and it takes each group of 5 only 10 seconds to drink their fill. That's going to take an awfully long time to water the whole group. You know what? Let's do the math. 1.5 million people, a low estimate on their population, but they're drinking 5 at a time, so that's 300,000 groups of drinkers. At 10 seconds each, that's 3 million seconds for all of the Israelites to drink from the magic rock. Divided by 60 is 50,000 minutes. Divided by another 60 is 833 hours. Divided by 24 is 34.7 days. So a month after Moses took his first sip, the last members of his congregation got theirs. I think a lot of Israelites just died of dehydration waiting in line at the water fountain. You know what? Let's calculate that. You can live about 3 days without water, which is actually pretty generous considering they were in the middle of the desert during a hot time of year and were already complaining about thirst before the water fountain appeared. But we'll go ahead and give them the full 3 days. 1.5 million divided by 34.7, the amount of days it would take for all of them to drink, and we get 43,227 Israelites drinking per day. Times 3, and we get 129,682 which are able to drink before the rest died. So out of 1.5 million people who left Egypt a few days before, Moses' crowd is down to 129,682 people. Wow, this is really not going as planned. That's 1.4 million dead from oversight, or 31/34. How's that for a fraction? Now, of course, with 600,000 adult males and roughly as many females, your population is closer to 2 or even 3 million. And that would mean that the 130,000 that are left over are going to have a lot of graves to dig next to their magic rock. See, math can be fun, but let's get back to the story. After this, King Amalek attacks Israel. And in this story, Moses raises his arms and the Israelites are winning the battle. But if he drops his arms, Amalek wins. So Aaron and Hur support his arms until the battle is over. Now, why can't Yahweh just murder them like he did the Egyptians? Why can't they just tie his arms up to a tree? Why does he have to raise his arms to win anyway? Is this connected to what people do in a sports stadium where they kind of do the wave? I don't know. But this is just another example of Yahweh playing favorites. He's chosen this one Semitic group as the only people deserving of his blessing, but makes them beg for it before helping. So much of this story reminds me of an abusive relationship that is not even funny. He'll help the Israelites, but if Moses can't hold up his arms for an entire day, something which is not humanly possible, then Yahweh will send an army to butcher his favorite people. Am I the only one who sees this as disgustingly dysfunctional? Now, immediately after the victory, Moses is told by Yahweh in Exodus 17:14 to inscribe a special document. No, I'm not going to paraphrase. I'm going to read it in Yahweh's words. Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Inscribe this in a document as a reminder and read it aloud to Joshua. I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under the heavens." So wait, Yahweh plans to erase the memory of Amalek from earth and wants Moses to not only record the memory of Amalek in a document, but to also read it to other people so that they will never forget. Commanding a person to record an event and inserting it into history's #1 best-selling and most widely distributed book is not how you blot out a memory. In fact, I dare say that it just might accomplish the exact opposite. Yahweh's really not looking too bright in this story. Now, at this point, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, who we met earlier, hears about Moses and his great exodus. So he visits the Israelite leader, and they discuss how Yahweh is greater than all of the other gods. That's right, still no monotheism. Then Moses tells Jethro how he sits as magistrate to judge offenses, and tells Jethro about the laws of El Elyon. Wait, what? The laws won't be given to the Israelites until they reach Mount Sinai, and those will be the laws of Yahweh, not El Elyon. We have another reference to a Canaanite deity, and the acknowledgement that the people had laws before their God supposedly gave them their commandments. Perhaps they're referring to the Hammurabi Code in this chapter. Anyway, Moses is apparently the only judge for over 1.5 million people, personally hearing cases for everything between murder and coveting thy neighbor's goat. Jethro chimes in with the suggestion that Moses sets chiefs over the people, dividing the population into groups of tens, 50s, hundreds, and thousands. Maybe each of those chiefs gets his own bill? Oh, no, it's presidents. Those chiefs can hear minor offenses, and Mo can judge the major offenses. And you'd think that delegation of labor would be a trait that Yahweh would have looked for when choosing a leader, but then again, this is the same God that chose a man who couldn't speak to crowd, needed Aaron to work his miracles, had no idea in which direction to walk to travel from Egypt to Canaan, and wasn't even circumcised. So I suppose it makes sense that Moses needs a backwoods priest from Midian to tell him how to delegate. And what will he be delegating? Enforcement of the laws that we will get to in the next episode. And if you thought there were only 10 commandments, then boy, I have a treat for you. That about wraps it up for this episode. I'd like to ask you to rate us on iTunes, like us on Facebook at facebook.com/dragonsandgenesis. If you have any questions or comments about the show, feel free to send us a message on Facebook. And as always, thank you for listening.